Pursuant to order of reference on Thursday, April 14th, the section of 20 of the Freezing Assets of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, statutory review of the Act, and I'd just like to welcome our two witnesses today. We've got Gary Kasparov and we've got Erwin Kotler. I don't think either need any kind of introduction, but I do want to welcome both of you here today. I'm going to try and keep the questions as tight as we can so we can get as many individuals in to ask questions. So if I try to be a little tighter on time, I apologize in advance, just so we can get as many rounds in as possible. Why don't we just go right to opening testimony? Mr. Kasparov, if you'd like to start, and then Mr. Kotler, and then we'll go back and forth like we normally do for questions. So, Mr. Kasparov, welcome, and the floor is yours, sir.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, I'm grateful for an opportunity to be here today and to speak about the nature, the goals, and the methods of Russian regime of Vladimir Putin. I'm not an outsider or an objective observer of these things. No one can be or should be objective about repression, torture, murder, and war. We do not owe Putin's victims objectivity. We owe them the truth. Vladimir Putin is about to celebrate 17 years of uninterrupted, unchallenged power in Russia. He was elected in year 2000 after being handpicked by Boris Yeltsin, and that was the last meaningful vote Russia ever had. Democracy in Russia has been systematically destroyed, along with every other aspect of civil society that might challenge Putin's hold on power. Do not speak of Putin's supposed popularity to uninformed Russia. A popular leader does not need to fake elections or destroy the free media or jail critics or kill opposition leaders. Status that is artificially fashioned by 24-hour propaganda, repression of all dissent, and the elimination of all rivals is not approval. It's acceptance. In the first years of Putin's rule, he was relatively weak, and he still needed friends abroad. He made very good use of G8 membership, even as he cracked down at home. How critics like me, like Boris Nemtsov, be right when we said Putin was an authoritarian, when he was welcomed as an equal with open arms and big smiles by the leaders of the free world? The social contract Putin had with the Russian people was that he would create stability in exchange for our freedom. As oil prices fell, Putin was forced to renege on that contract. Hundreds of thousands of Russians marched in 2011, 2012 in the streets to protest election corruption and economic failure. Putin's answer, as we all know, was repression, propaganda, and war. To distract and rally the people, Putin no longer needed friends internationally. He needed enemies, big enemies. Anti-Western, especially anti-American propaganda on Russian television, is far more vicious than anything that ever existed in the Soviet Union in my lifetime. This war propaganda was followed by a real war, the invasion and annexation of Crimea, first denied by Putin and later proudly confirmed. When the offensive slowed in Ukraine, Putin needed a new target, a new place to look tough, Syria. Putin isn't there for ISIS, Islamic State, of course. He's there to prop up his ally, Bashar Assad, and to produce lots of exciting war footage for Russian television. Putin is very good at finding places where no one with the power to stop him will stand up to him. Georgia, Ukraine, Syria. The danger is that he may eventually misjudge where he can go because he has encountered so little resistance so far. To better guarantee his hold on power, Putin has targeted the only forces he sees as threats: NATO, the European Union, and the United States. Putin has worked actively for years to undermine the unity of the free world with propaganda and by supporting politicians who share his goals. Putin's machine supports movements like Brexit, far-right groups like those of Marine Le Pen in France and Golden Dawn in Greece, and potential agents of chaos like Donald Trump. Now Italy is on the brink. Cyber war, information war, the export of corruption and intimidation. These are weapons Putin uses frequently and effectively. Something must be done, and soon, because the price of stopping him will only continue to rise. Putin cannot go back to being friends. His power in Russia depends on eternal confrontation. There is no common ground, and seeking it only wastes time and further emboldens him. The language of appeasement is comforting and politically convenient domestically, but it has always failed to stop foreign dictators, and it will always fail. To stop Putin, to deter his aggression, you must target the only thing he cares about: his hold on power in Russia. The best way to target Putin's power is to take aim at his agents and cronies, those who wield the levers of power and who benefit the most from Putin's rule. By forcing Putin's elite to choose between him and their comfortable lifestyles abroad, it is still possible to create a split, or at least to deter the worst of his aggressions. The individuals who can influence Putin must be targeted, or there can be no effective deterrence. Putin doesn't care about the Russian people, the Russian economy, or the image of Russia abroad. I repeat, he does not care. Dictators don't ask why. They only ask why not. Deterrence is the answer. Very strong penalties must be ready and widely known. Deterrence is difficult because its fruits are not apparent. If it works, nothing happens. To those who say the sanctions have not worked, can you say what Putin might have done without them in place? Or say why he worked so frantically to have them repealed? 10 years ago, when I would give testimony like this, I was told that Putin was a Russian problem. I said yes, but unless he's contained, soon he will be a regional problem, and then he will be everyone's problem. Today, Putin is in Ukraine, in Syria, meddling in American elections, waging global cyber war, sponsoring fascists across Europe, and spreading fake news and propaganda worldwide. The alternative to appeasement is not war. It is deterrence. The best way to avoid a conflict is to convince your opponent that he will lose. A Canadian Magnitsky Act will demonstrate the will to stand up in order to prevent more aggression. It will send a message that there are consequences for torture, for murder, and for war. It will be the most effective weapon against Putin's new type of hybrid war of propaganda and intimidation. Make no mistake, there is a war going on whether you want to admit it or not. And it's very easy to lose a war that you refuse to acknowledge even exists. Thank you.
Mr. Collar.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Like Mr. Kasparov, I'm delighted to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to participate in the context of your review of the Freezing Assets of Corrupt Officials Act and the Special Economic Powers Act, the whole against the backdrop of a unanimous House of Commons motion last June and a related private members' bill that I introduced, the Global Justice Accountability Act, calling on the government to enact global justice legislation to, among other things, hold human rights violators to account, including, among others, those that Mr. Kasparov has addressed in his remarks. Indeed, this hearing is as timely as it is necessary, for we have been witnessing a resurgent global authoritarianism finding expression in a massive domestic repression on the one hand, as exemplified not only in Russia, but certainly there, but as well in Iran, in China, in Saudi Arabia, in Turkey, and the like, and underpinned by a pervasive and persistent culture of impunity, matched, regrettably, by a democratic contraction rather than the democracies empowering themselves through legislation to act. Fortunately, as we meet, the U.S. Congress has just passed global Magnitsky legislation following their adoption of Justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation in 2012. And again, as we meet, an all-party coalition of members of Parliament in the United Kingdom is undertaking a similar initiative. Accordingly, I propose to organize my remarks briefly around three themes. First, an abbreviated critique of the two pieces of legislation before you. I've read the witness testimony, and so I need not elaborate on that critique. Two, the nature and raison d'etre for not only Justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation, but really the global justice accountability legislation. And finally, as a corollary, but not unimportantly, the purposes to be served by such legislation. Again, I've read the testimony that has represented the purposes of a sanctions regime. I think there may be some reasons that have not been addressed, which I'd like to put before you. Beginning first with the Freezing of Assets of Corrupt Officials Act adopted in 2011, there is a major problem and limitation in this legislation as appeared in the testimony before you. This legislation, which as you know was adopted in the onset of the Arab Spring, the problem is that its application can only be triggered by a request from a foreign state. But where, as it may often happen, the very officials of that state may themselves be beneficiaries of corruption and complicit in a culture of corruption and criminality. Such a limitation as the testimony before you gave us, in one case study in massive corruption in the Maldives, means that the culture of corruption and impunity is maintained rather than held to account through this legislation. In the matter of CIMA, much of the Canadian sanctions regime under this is pursuant to a UN sanctions regime or Canadian or Canada associating with a multilateral regime in that regard. However, the threshold for unilateral Canadian sanctions action, again, as the testimony before you summarized, is both too high and too general, and therefore has rarely been invoked. It has resulted in only 2 prosecutions with respect to the CIMA legislation, and those 2 prosecutions were related to Iran-related activities, suggesting thereby that the triggering of this had to do again with the overall sanctions regime of an international character rather than the empowering of Canada to be acting where necessary on its own. Which brings me to the second theme, and that is the raison d'etre for the adoption by the US Congress, now the UK, the European Parliament, and my own tabling both of Justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation in 2011 and a Global Human Rights Accountability Act in 2015, following, as I said, the unanimous motion to that effect adopted by Parliament. It's not that I was uninformed of the two pieces of legislation before you at the time. It is precisely because these two pieces of legislation, whose critique I abbreviated for the reasoning I mentioned, warranted these two initiatives. In a matter of justice for Sergei Magnitsky, as you know, and I need not labor this, but Sergei Magnitsky uncovered the largest corporate tax fraud in Russian history, documented the officials responsible for that fraud, who then themselves arranged for him to be arrested, detained, tortured, murdered in prison, and then in a Kafkaesque cover-up, then prosecuted posthumously Magnitsky for the very fraud that they perpetrated. And so, justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation was introduced in order to combat what is, in effect, a case study of both the culture of corruption and the culture of criminality and impunity in Russia. But where the criminals, regrettably, can still travel, can still launder their assets, and not only be rewarded at home, but be the beneficiaries of their corruption and criminality abroad, including as well in countries like Canada. That is why I introduced the legislation in October 2011 and was joined shortly thereafter by Boris Nemtsov, the leading, mentioned as well by Gary Kasparov, the leading democratic opposition leader in Russia, who came to Canada to support justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation, as he put it, in order to combat both the culture of corruption, the culture of criminality, and in particular, the culture of impunity that underpinned both. But you may say, Russia is not the only major human rights violator, and this type of legislation may appear to be singling out Russia for sanctions. I must say this would not be the first time, and it's important historically, and I'll be very brief, to appreciate that Russia has been singled out. And I'll take one example because of the telling impact that that had, and that was the Jackson-Vanik congressional legislation in the 70s, which led to the opening of the gates for emigration from the former Soviet Union at the time, and then the Helsinki Final Act and other related sanctions, which it has been said brought about, though, if I may borrow a Marxist metaphor, the withering away of the former Soviet Union because of an effective sanctions regime that targeted the former Soviet Union as a whole. As well as someone who represented political prisoners in that former Soviet Union, I know from discussions with them the importance of conveying a message to those who were then in the Gulag that they are not alone, that we are with them, that we will be enacting these sanctions, and that we will not relent until they and their country become free. Yet the resurgent authoritarianism we are seeing today mandates a global human rights act because, as you would readily say, and as I acknowledge, Russia, while being a major human rights violator, while being maybe the most threatening of the major human rights violators because of its externalized aggression as well as its domestic repression, is not the only human rights violator, as recognized in the US legislation, the UK, the European Parliament, and the like. Indeed, someone who has represented political prisoners and continues to do so in Iran, China, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and as we meet, these political prisoners and their plight provide a looking glass into the culture of criminality and culture of impunity in these respective countries. And therefore, I understand the importance of globalizing sanctions. Let me take one other case study, and then I'll move to my final point. That is the case of Iran. Clearly, the issue of sanctions with respect to Iran helped bring Iran to the negotiating table and helped bring about the P5+1 nuclear agreement with Iran. But what we sometimes ignore and what remains sanitized has been the other fourfold criminal conduct of Iran. When I say the other fourfold, I'm referring to Iran as the leading state sponsor of international terrorism, not because I say so, because the U.S. State Department and others continue to say so. 2, because of its regional hegemonic aggression, whether it be in Syria or Yemen or Iraq and the like. 3, because of its state-sanctioned incitement to genocide. And I remind the members of this committee that it was the Supreme Court of this country in the Mugesera case in 2005, which held that the very incitement to genocide constitutes the crime in and of itself, whether or not acts of genocide follow. And therefore, such global sanctioning legislation could also catch and hold to account those who engage in state-sanctioned incitement to genocide. And finally, the massive domestic repression in Iran, whether it be the fact that Iran is the state that executes more people per capita than any other country in the world, whether it be its prosecution and persecution. I can go on, you know it, Iran Accountability Week has demonstrated and the like. But the most disturbing and indeed astonishing datum in this regard is that the Minister of Justice of Iran, as a case study of the culture of impunity, and who remains unsanctioned, is Mustafa Pur-Muhammadi, who is responsible for the mass murder of dissidents in Iran in 1988, for which this Parliament declared September 1st to be Political Prisoner Day in Iran, and where he continues to serve without having any kind of sanctions in that regard. There are others I could mention, but for reasons of time, I will not. And so let me at this point conclude with the purposes of the sanctions regime in one-liners, because the witness testimony before this committee has stated that a sanctioning regime is basically organized for the purposes of securing 3 objectives. 1, to coerce a change in behavior. 2, to constrain the activities of individuals or groups. And 3, to signal a violation of international norms. But somewhat ignored or marginalized are a number of compelling purposes that underpin not only justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation, but why I propose that this Parliament enact a global justice accountability legislation that would be as comprehensive and as inclusive as it would in holding global violators to account. And the objectives, therefore, would be, number 1, the importance of combating the persistent and pervasive culture of corruption, criminality, and impunity. 2, deterring thereby other would-be or prospective violators. 3, make the Parliament of Canada the pursuant of international justice as we seek to be the pursuant of domestic justice. 4, to uphold the rule of law and justice and accountability in our own territory through visa bans, through asset seizures, and the like. The recent evidence of how Magnitsky assets have been laundered in Canada is just but one case study of the importance of having this type of comprehensive legislation. 5th, to protect Canadian business operating abroad. Magnitsky uncovered the largest corporate tax fraud in Russian history that was perpetrated against a UK-based entity, Hermitage Capital. So this type of legislation does not only protect the integrity of commerce in Canada, it protects our Canadian businessmen operating abroad. Number 6, it will operate so as to name and shame the human rights violators, because not only will they not be able to launder their assets, not only will they not be able to travel freely, not only will they not be able to send their children to schools abroad and the like, but banks will not lend to them, businesses will not deal with them. There will be serious reputational damage, and this will uphold the integrity of both the rule of law as well as the rule of commerce. 6, such legislation would not bind the Canadian government. Rather, it empowers the Canadian government. It allows us to be a protector of human rights and not an enabler of the violators of human rights. And finally, and most important, it tells the human rights defenders, the Magnitskys of today in Russia, or those in any of the other countries that I mentioned, and right now I'm involved, such as Raif Badawi in Saudi Arabia, or Leopoldo Lopez in Venezuela, or the Baha'i in Iran. It tells them that they are not alone, that we stand in solidarity with them, that we will not relent in our pursuit of justice for them, and that we will undertake our international responsibilities in the pursuit of justice generally and in the combating of the culture of impunity and criminality in these respective countries. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you, Mr. Kotler, and Mr. Kasparov, thank you. Well, let's get right to questions. We'll start with Mr. Kent, sir. 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you both for attending today. Mr. Kasparov, for your courageous defense of democracy, the rule of law, and truth. And Mr. Kotler, it is always an honor to share a room with you. Mr. Kasparov, this committee has heard abundant testimony in support of the Magnitsky Act as originally proposed and its different forms now, the global Magnitsky Act passed by the United States, the pending legislation in the UK. But we've also heard voices, opinions shared by Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister, that Canada doesn't need more sanctions, that in fact dialogue is preferable. At the same time, and these voices suggested that Mr. Putin, for example, or other despots like him would not change their ways because of sanctions. You earlier this week said in fact that the Magnitsky Act, as it now exists in the United States, actually by cutting the freedom of Russia's kleptocrats scares Mr. Putin. Did you mean that it does cause him uncertainty and actual fear?
It does cause him uncertainty because it undermines one of the fundamental rules of mafia state. Putin is not a democratically elected leader. He's a dictator who whose rule is based very much on immunity that he provides for his enablers, for Russian elite inside Russia, and also after they commit crimes in Russia, steal money, they were able to keep this money in safe harbor abroad. Those were two very important elements of Putin's grip on power, because he was seen as the only one who could guarantee such a comfortable scheme of getting rich and protecting their funds, and eventually even sending families to this comfortable lifestyle abroad. Any meaningful act that will attack the interests of this group, Russian elite, even at the mid-level, will have a dent, could be even a massive dent in Putin's war chest. Because, the way mafia operates, it's a full loyalty for the boss in exchange for full protection. Every hitman must be protected. And I'm not saying that all these people committed, really bad crimes, though in case of Magnitsky, we understand, it was mind-boggling, that Magnitsky was prosecuted posthumously for the crimes that he unfolded. But that's why Putin was so aggressive, and his cronies and his agents and his lobbyists by trying to repeal Magnitsky Act. Because, it will hurt the very foundation of his, let's call it, social contract with Russian elite. Will it lead immediately to his demise? I don't know. But I can tell you that's the opposite, is that if he sees any weakness in trying to repeal or even to soften the sanctions, that will be trumpeted as his big victory. And the way Putin has been operating in the last few years, after his aggression in Ukraine and other aggressive foreign policy endeavors, he has been trying to present Russian public, which lives under this 24/7 poisonous propaganda, himself as the only savior of the country against global conspiracy. And he knows that dictator can make many mistakes except one: he cannot look weak. And that's why he needs victories. And unfortunately, he was able to present many of his foreign policy acts, whether they were criminal, like annexation of Crimea or war in eastern Ukraine, or other acts of meddling in elections and political life in Europe or America, or genocidal war in Syria, as as the element of his strengths. That's why I keep repeating that anything that goes under the skin of dictator, anything that makes him look weak, especially if it's a foreign-born defeat, it's extremely valuable.
We have learned that the National Crime Agency in the United Kingdom estimates that $100 billion a year of ill-gotten funds passes through the United Kingdom. We have heard skepticism expressed before this committee that those sorts of funds are not likely to find a destination, that rights offenders from Russia are not likely to seek haven in Canada. Despite the evidence, we also heard that Canada has a lack of capacity in prioritizing and trying to detect those funds or individuals. Could you comment to that?
Look, money is always looking for a safe harbor, and we are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, if not more, of this money that will be definitely looking for a place to be invested. So we know that the UK for a long time was one of the sort of preferred destinations. We know that there are a few places in America, though US always had tougher regulations, which made it more difficult. For instance, Dubai is another place where you can find tons of Russian money. Again, this money is welcome there. So I will not be surprised if you eventually see Canada as a potential destination, especially if Canadian government, demonstrates willingness to make a deal, any kind of deal, with Russia. That could be a kind of a signal to look for Canada as another safe haven.
Thank you. And just one very brief question for Mr. Kotler. In light of the House of Commons' unanimous support on the Magnitsky Act in the motion last year, are you surprised by the position of Canada's Foreign Minister opposing such legislation today?
Well, I don't understand that the Foreign Minister has opposed that legislation. From what I understand, he's awaiting to see the outcome of the proceedings before this committee. And this relates to your opening statement, which is an important one in a larger context, about engagement, let's say, with Russia or other human rights violators. Let me say that, and I think in the world in which we live, we have to, and I support engagement, but it's not an either-or situation. It's not a question of engagement without sanctions or sanctions without engagement. I think we can both engage, as we need to do, and at the same time sanction, which may be necessary to do. So it's not whether to engage, but how to engage. Simply put, will we be indulgent of Putin's enablers and thereby become enablers ourselves, however inadvertently, or will we hold the human rights violators to account, at least with respect to our own jurisdiction, as to whether they can travel here or launder their assets here? As Boris Nemtsov put it when he was here, and said it best, that justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation, as he put it, is pro-Russian legislation. It's legislation on behalf of the Russian people, but it holds the Russian violators to account.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kotler. Mr. Kent, we're going to move over to Mr. Miller now for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you both. It's great to have Canada's foremost human rights defender in front of us, together with the world's greatest chess player. It's a true honor to be able to ask questions to you about this extremely compelling case on the bodies of legislation that we are studying. For your benefit, what we've essentially, there's no conclusion yet. We haven't finished our report. We haven't completed the witness testimony. But what we have been able to identify is clearly a gap in the ability to freeze assets of foreign nationals who have committed gross human rights violations. Now, proceeding from that premise, I guess, or conclusion to putting that into effect is a lot more difficult than it seems at the outset. There are grave concerns with respect, in a pluralist democracy, with respect to the rule of law as understood in many facets, one of the facets being gathering evidence of those gross human rights violations. Now, the case at hand that you've mentioned, obviously there was a sufficient determination that those occurred, so I'm not contesting that. What I'm trying to ask, I guess, is placing those into a body of law with a concern for obviously the rule of law, the ability of someone who is accused of these acts to appear to be able to plead their case, because you are asking us to freeze assets of someone that may be ill-gotten, in which case there's already a law in our criminal code which deals with that, or they may simply be assets that were acquired in a different manner, with the view of freezing them pursuant to a deterrent motive or a moral imperative. And there are valuable arguments for that, but essentially what I would like to perhaps hear from you, Mr. Kotler, is your concern. Obviously, you're a jurist and a preeminent lawyer. I would like to hear your concerns for the rule of law. And then, Mr. Kasparov, what do you think the effect, and you mentioned it earlier when you responded to Mr. Kent about the impact on perhaps Russia of this type of sanction by a country such as Canada, and perhaps the countermeasures that we need to be aware of if we were to enact this legislation vis-a-vis such a country or indeed other countries. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's important that whatever sanctioning legislation is ultimately adopted, be it the type of legislation I proposed, a template of that kind, etc., which seeks to both amend CIMA and include the justice and includes acting with respect to corrupt officials, but doing so not simply on the request, but on our own initiative, that there also be a due process dimension to that legislation. I don't think we can act peremptorily or arbitrarily. The whole point of the legislation is that we intend to act in accordance with the rule of law and to pursue justice internationally and domestically. And the only way we can do that is that we assure that people do have rights of redress with respect to that legislation. That is built into the bill that I provided. It's also in the legislation in the US and in the UK. I think it is possible, on the one hand, to empower the Canadian government to act so as to combat impunity, and at the same time to ensure that in the course of doing so we provide appropriate notice, hearing and rights of those who may be caught up in the orbit of that legislation.
One thing I know from reading a few history books is that every delay in responding to dictator, an aggressive dictator, it's pushing the price up. So when Boris Nemtsov was here, I don't know whether in this room or somewhere else, arguing for Magnitsky case, you know, we live in a different world. It was before invasion of Ukraine, before annexation of Crimea, and obviously before Boris Nemtsov was shot dead in front of Kremlin. So it tells you that the regime, Putin's regime, is developing, I'm not sure it's the right word, but it is moving in one direction. You talked about violation of the laws, but, you know, we have to find a way to penalize Putin's regime for violating the fundamental international law that secured peace in Europe and in the rest of the world after 1945, that the borders cannot be changed by force. There was only one case of Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait, and international community, you know, had a forceful response. If you pretend that annexation of Crimea is just, you know, it's a local affair between Russia and Ukraine, or it's something that, you know, it's not, it doesn't have a fundamental consequences for global security, you know, then it sends a message to Putin that all bets are off. Eventually, you know, for those who are arguing that, you know, Ukraine is not NATO. Yeah, Ukraine is not NATO. I understand there are no obligations to defend Ukraine militarily. There, of course, the Budapest Memorandum had signatures of U.S. President and British Prime Minister, alongside with Boris Yeltsin's signature, and it was an exchange, you know, of Ukrainian nukes, the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, for Russian guarantee of territorial integrity. So then, you know, you basically invite Putin to test the resolve of the free world elsewhere, and have no doubts that he will. The question is not if Putin strikes tomorrow or next month or next year. It's when and where he strikes, because he has made foreign policy aggression a staple of his domestic propaganda. So he will need, to feed, the Russian public with this red meat of his successes, global successes. And while I understand your concerns about sort of intricate details of Canadian law, and obviously you don't want, just to make a mistake by sort of hurting potentially innocent people, I mean, it's up to you to come up with a plan to protect the integrity of our world that we live, the security. Because unless you do something, the Putin's war against the free world, Putin's policy of spreading chaos worldwide will continue. And he proved to be a very good enabler of creating chaos. And unlike many other politicians, his counterparts in the free world, he plays not, a game, of just of small corners, but the geopolitical game. He understands that the Syrian refugees could help his buddies in Europe, all the fascist parties, to gain more popularities because, it shatters European political system, and it helps him to have more friends in power and eventually to help him to lift sanctions or to weaken them. So that's why I think it's up to you to decide how you want to oppose this aggression. But you shouldn't argue whether you will inevitably face the ultimate challenge, and the ultimate challenge could be when Putin will test your resolve in the Baltic states.
Thank you.
It's not that difficult, to imagine it, since a KGB colonel with a lot of experience in hybrid wars, will try to make sure, that NATO is nothing else but a paper tiger.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kasparov. Mr. Miller, we're going to move over to Madame Lebriere for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And so well-informed presentations. And if I may say so, Mr. Kasparov, I heard in your presentation of Putin's moves the great chess mind behind this analysis of the various moves. I would like to ask you, we've had testimonies of people telling us if we put sanctions on individuals, it will just increase the repression afterwards. And I'd like you to comment on that.
First of all, I want to defend the integrity of my game. I think, calling Putin a chess player is just, it's a form of intellectual insult to the game of chess. No. This is, you're not. This is, as you can guess, it's not the first time when I have to confront, the question, by trying to sort of to defend vigorously the game that I've been playing for my entire life. To be serious, chess is a game of strategy. And dictators don't play strategic game. They're always very good in tactical game, because strategy means you can think long-term. Dictator cares about survival. So Putin is a very good player, but I would rather call him a poker player. Because in poker, you can win by playing with a very weak hand, but if you can bluff, you can raise the stakes. And you should be sort of a good reader of opponent's mind. And again, he's a good KGB agent who proved to be very, sort of efficient, mind reader of many foreign leaders. So by winning their trust and their confidence, and eventually, of course, betraying them. So Putin always plays with a weak hand. Russia today is a pale shadow of the Soviet Union militarily or economically, but Putin knows, the rules of this gamemanship. So how to blackmail, how to intimidate, how to threaten, and he always expects, his opponents, even having a very strong hand, to fold the cards. So my response my answer to your question about, further repressions, look, my friend Boris is dead. Most of people who fought with me in Russia, those who were part of these big demonstrations in 2011, 2012, they're either in exile like myself, in jail, or worse. So what is left in Russia is just, it's a very scarce group of people who represent no real danger to the regime, and that's why the regime allows them just to do little things. So we know that Putin regime reached a point where, it will not go down from internal dissent unless it's being provoked by foreign-born defeat. It's like, Soviet Union retreating from Afghanistan. So it's unlike Americans in 1975, the retreat was orderly. Russians were not fleeing Afghanistan, so no panic. They even left Najibullah regime, the pro-Moscow regime there for 3 more years. But still, what people in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, in Baltic states, even in Russia, what they saw, empire was no longer striking. Empire was retreating. February 15, 1989. And how long Soviet Union, did survive after that? Not for long. So anything that could help to demonstrate that Putin is not invincible, that Russia is under Putin is not, global player, but, it's a country that is suffering, from poor economy and deteriorating living standards, and it's, and only Putin's buddies and close friends could be beneficiaries of this corrupt, aggressive regime. Anything that will weaken Putin's image in the eyes of ordinary Russians, but even more importantly about Russian elite, may lead to unpredictable consequences. I'm not telling you I know, when Putin is going to lose power, because most likely for a dictator like Putin, losing power means losing everything else. So he's not going to retire. That's bad news. The good news, he also doesn't know. But you can basically, you can bring this moment closer. And, again, don't be you should not be afraid by some warnings that if Putin goes down, it could be worse. I mean, what could be worse? Yes, when I hear this argument, it just, my blood is boiling. You look at Syria, what could be worse? 500,000 dead, 10 million refugees, European political system is in trouble, rise of terrorism. What could be worse than potential intervention in 2011 or 2012 that were stopped because we were afraid of the consequences? Yes, Putin's collapse means the collapse of the system because it's a one-man show. It's not a Politburo, it's just one-man dictatorship. But I would rather have some chaotic development, a chaos, instead of the quiet graveyard. Because, with Putin, we know the outcome. And every day he stays in power, he will inflict more damage to what is left of Russian society. And he will continue his aggressive foreign policy. And God knows who will be the next target. Because he will not stop. There's no way that you can offer him some concessions, appeasement. He'll take it. He'll take it and then he'll move on because he has to move. It's a rule of his engagement. And his survival will require, more and more concessions. And at a certain point, he will cross the border, and then you will have to be involved in a much bigger confrontation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madame Lavrier. We're going to move over to Mr. Sandy for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for coming, for providing your very compelling testimony today. Professor Kotler, I have 2 parts of a question for you, and this is just to maybe give us a bit of background on how we should approach this very challenging subject. We've heard testimony that sanctions in the United Kingdom, even those that were put in place to comply with the United Nations Security Council, were being overturned due to a lack of due process. And we know that although there are not any trials happening in Canada, there's still suits that are filed here. Do you think that there's a possibility of us having some sanctions challenged and overturned in Canada?
Well, I think whenever you have legislation that is either overbroad or unclear, then you run the risk of both a challenge and then the uncertainty of what a court might do. That's why I said that the issue of due process needs to be built into any sanctions legislation that we might seek to adopt. Effectively, what I think we should be considering as a parliamentary committee and then as a parliament is amending CIMA in 3 ways. And those 3 ways would address what is now a level of generality in CIMA itself, a lack of specificity as to what can trigger a sanctions regime. And again, when I say trigger a sanctions regime, I'm not saying that the government then is compelled to enact that regime. It means it's empowered to do so where in its judgment it believes it is so appropriate. Now, let me just give me 3 examples. The first thing is that we amend CIMA to sanction internationally recognized gross human rights violations. In other words, this would include responsibility for or complicity in, and I'll just borrow from my own legislation, but it's part of a template in that regard, extrajudicial killings, torture, or other gross violations of internationally recognized human rights committed against any individuals in any foreign country. That's one. It's specific and as to the human rights violations, and it's included in the legislation in CIMA, which does not now have it. Second, to amend CIMA so as to protect those individuals, like Magnitsky, those brave human rights defenders, be they in Russia or in Iran or in Turkey or wherever, who seek to expose illegal activity carried out by government officials, as Magnitsky did, or who seek to obtain, exercise, defend, or promote internationally recognized human rights and freedoms, as Raif Badawi in Saudi Arabia. That's the second thing. And then the third thing, and this I link up here with Gary Kasparov in this thing, one of the worst horrors that we continue to experience is the ongoing war crimes and crimes against humanity daily in Syria. And this has been going on now for 5.5 years since the scorched earth policy of Assad's regime began in March 2011. And it has continued tragically with impunity. I would like to also see CIMA amended to include both the preventing, if possible, and the sanctioning of mass atrocity crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. I know this is one of the recommendations made before you by one of the witnesses, Jared Genzer. I would associate myself with that because I think the responsibility to protect should, in fact, also be written into this legislation.
I just want to raise another point with you, something that you mentioned in your testimony when you talked about redress, and I want to talk about the concept of judicial review. I'm sure you know that in the United Nations, they put someone in place, or they appointed someone as an ombudsperson, Kimberly Prost, to deal with the UN sanctions against the Al-Qaeda operatives. So I was wondering, do you feel that that would merit something in our own domestic legislation to, in some ways, make sure that the legislation has teeth, but also to create a transparency where there's more legitimacy in the sanctions if they're ever applied? Do you think that's a concept we should look at?
Well, I think that if the legislation is crafted carefully, specifically, both in its identification of the criminality to be sanctioned and in its identification of the remedies available from a due process point of view, then I think we can leave it to our governmental authorities and our parliament and courts to address and redress any problems that may arise. I read Kimberly Prost's submissions before you. I knew her well. We worked together in the Department of Justice when I was minister. I understand the reasons with respect to the ombudsperson in her particular situation and concern. I'm not sure it would be something that would be necessarily warranted in Canadian legislation, but it is something that can be explored.
Thank you. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but we do, Ms. Shito, we got you on the list, so why don't you ask a couple questions before we have to wrap up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for your testimony today. Let me start thanking Mr. Kotler for your service to this country. You've been an MP for 11 years and a minister for a few years. Since the landscape south of the border is changing, we're going to have a new president in January. So I'm pretty sure the foreign policy relations to Russia is going to change. So the question I'm pretty sure is fitting to you with your political background. What kind of impact are we going to have on Canada, if there's any?
Well, it's hard to speculate because one of the things about the President-elect Trump is that he is unpredictable, particularly in matters relating to foreign policy. I would say that with respect to the United States, given their system and the separation of powers, then it is possible there for Congress to do as they have done, and that is in 2012 passed Justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation and have a documented list of those who cannot enter the U.S., who cannot launder their assets in the U.S. and the like. Similarly, in the Global Justice Accountability Act that Congress has now passed and will go into the Senate, there too the legislation, can be adopted without the president, though clearly the president then will have a role afterwards with respect to the bilateral relationships with the countries or from which the violators come. I think if you have global legislation, it makes it more effective, and one is not subject to the notion that you've singled out a particular country. This is not a matter of going against countries, it's a matter of going against human rights violators, and it's a matter of supporting those countries, in effect, in terms of supporting the rule of law and justice and the people of those countries, because you're going against the violators that have been enjoying impunity because of a culture of corruption or a culture of criminality. So with respect to President Trump, number one, I think we can here be independent as a parliament and as a government and as a country and enact our own global justice accountability legislation. Two, I think that may send a signal to other countries in Europe to maybe do the same, and the European Parliament has already endorsed that approach. And three, it could support the congressional action taken in the U.S., and that may buttress what President Trump might then decide to do in that regard. So let's look at it the other way around. Canada influencing others rather than us being influenced by Trump.
As you can guess, I was quite worried about Trump's consistency in praising Putin, and because that was probably the only consistent line in his entire campaign. But again, we know that this consistency could be short-lived, and I wouldn't make any predictions about U.S. foreign policy before we see who is nominated to be the Secretary of State. Actually, most of the names in the list, they're known for their quite hard standing against Russia. So like Ambassador Bolton, Governor Romney, Senator Corker. So for instance, any of them, or even General Petraeus, that will signal that Trump's fantasy relations with Putin may not, develop the way Putin expected them to be developed. But again, with President-elect Trump, I would be very cautious in saying anything before we actually see the nomination being announced and then being sort of approved by the Congress, by the Senate. Though I also see some names on the list that are making me much less comfortable.
Thank you. Mr. Kotler, Mr. Kasparov, thank you very much. And as usual, we could have had you for 2 or 3 hours, but we appreciate the short time that we did have in terms of what you had.
I would like to submit this. It's a written testimony, so that
absolutely.
Thank you very much.
That would be great. And as we tell all our witnesses, if there's anything after the fact that you'd like to submit to the committee, by all means, we'd love to see that. So thank you very much. And to the committee, thank you as well. And with that, the meeting's adjourned.